I've always been drawn to the past, fascinated by relics and stories that hint at a time when life was simpler, or so we like to think. That's why I couldn't resist signing up for a unique weekend adventure, a ride on an authentic retro train advertised as a trip back in time. The brochure boasted of scenic routes, historical tidbits, and an unforgettable experience aboard the Starlight Express. It was early October when we gathered at a tiny station tucked away in the Appalachian foothills. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine and the distant hum of a steam engine. About 20 of us had assembled, some snapping pictures, others sipping coffee from paper cups. The train loomed in the background like a memory brought to life, its dark green carriages adorned with golden lettering and intricate details that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. The conductor, a tall, gaunt man in a pressed uniform, greeted each of us as we handed him our tickets. His manner was formal, almost rehearsed, and his expression betrayed no warmth. I remember noticing how his gloved hands never seemed to move more than necessary, and his pale blue eyes seemed to look through us rather than at us. Inside, the train was everything the brochure had promised. Plush velvet seats, brass fixtures, and glowing lanterns that cast a soft, amber light. It smelled faintly of polished wood and something else, a scent I couldn't quite place but found unsettlingly familiar. We were barely 20 minutes into the ride when I noticed something odd. The train windows, which should have offered views of rolling hills and autumn foliage, showed nothing but an impenetrable gray mist. At first, I thought it was just an early morning fog, but it didn't shift or thin. It was as if the world outside had vanished, leaving only this endless, shapeless void. People began to notice, murmurs rising among the passengers. "Isn't it supposed to be a scenic route?" someone asked. A man with a camera peered out the window, tapping the glass as if to clear it. No one had an answer, and the conductor, when approached, simply shrugged and said, "Enjoy the ride." But it wasn't just the mist. The carriage itself felt colder, the lanterns dimmer than they had been when we boarded. And then came the shadows. They appeared faintly at first, flickering at the edges of the carriage. I thought it was my imagination until I saw one linger behind a fellow passenger, a formless silhouette standing perfectly still as the man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The unease was palpable now. Conversations trailed off. And as the mist thickened outside, so did the presence of the shadows inside. The murmurs of curiosity soon gave way to a tense silence. No one said it aloud, but we were all thinking the same thing: something wasn't right. The mist outside the windows was unnatural, like smoke frozen in time, and the shadows in the carriage, they didn't behave the way shadows should. I sat near the back of the car, close enough to watch the conductor as he moved between the compartments. His footsteps were deliberate, echoing faintly on the wooden floor. When he passed by me, I couldn't help but ask, how much longer until the first stop? He paused, his pale eyes meeting mine. For a moment, it seemed as if he hadn't heard me, and then he smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile, it was a small, strange curve of his lips that sent a chill down my spine. "We'll get there when we're meant to," he said, his voice low and almost melodic. Without waiting for a response, he turned and continued down the aisle. "Weird guy, huh?" said a woman across from me. She was probably in her late 30s, dressed casually in jeans and a flannel shirt. Her name tag from the group registration read, Karen. This is supposed to be some historical thing, right? Maybe he's just staying in character. Maybe, I said, though I wasn't convinced. Karen leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You noticed the windows, right? It's like there's nothing out there. And those shadows, you've seen them too?" I nodded, feeling a tight knot form in my stomach. "Yeah. I thought I was imagining it at first, but there's something off about them." Before she could respond, a loud thud echoed from the carriage ahead of us. Everyone froze. The sound came again, followed by the faint creak of metal under strain. It was as if something heavy had fallen, or been dropped. A man named Paul, who'd been sitting with his teenage son, stood up. "I'll check it out," he announced, his voice firm despite the unease etched on his face. He gave his son a reassuring pat on the shoulder before heading toward the sound. We all watched as Paul disappeared through the sliding door at the end of the car. The silence that followed was suffocating. Minutes ticked by, and he didn't return. Karen glanced at me, her face pale. "Do you think he's okay?" I didn't know what to say. The oppressive stillness was broken only by the faint hum of the train's engine and the occasional creak of the carriage. And then, just as suddenly as the noise had started, the lights flickered. The lanterns that had seemed so warm and inviting now cast a sickly yellow glow, and in that unsteady light, the shadows grew darker, more defined. They were no longer confined to the edges of the room, they began to move, stretching and shifting as if alive. A young boy sitting near the front began to cry. His mother tried to console him, but her own fear was evident in the tremor of her voice. Karen reached for my arm. "Something's wrong. We need to do something." But before I could respond, the door Paul had walked through slid open. We all turned, expecting to see him return. Instead, a shadow, taller, denser, and more human-shaped than the others, stood there, unmoving. And then it stepped inside. The figure in the doorway wasn't just a shadow, it was something more. It had a form, but it didn't reflect the lantern light. Its outline shimmered like heat waves rising from asphalt, yet its presence chilled the air around it. For a long moment, no one moved. The thing stepped forward, its indistinct shape gaining clarity. It resembled a man, but there were no features, no face, no eyes, just a dark void where a person should have been. The young boy near the front let out a piercing scream, breaking the trance that had fallen over us. His mother grabbed him, pulling him close, but the figure didn't react. It simply stood there, as if assessing the room. "Paul." Karen whispered beside me, her voice trembling. "Do you think?" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The shadow turned its head, or what passed for a head, toward us. The gesture was deliberate, almost human, and yet it was entirely alien. It began to move down the aisle, its steps soundless but heavy with intent. "Stay back," a man shouted, standing up from his seat. His name tag read Mark. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of guy who looked like he could handle himself in a fight. He raised his arms as if to block the figure's path. The shadow stopped. For a moment, it seemed to consider Mark's defiance. Then, without warning, it lunged. It didn't touch him, not physically. Instead, it seemed to envelop him, its dark form swallowing his body like smoke curling around a flame. Mark's scream was short and sharp, cutting off abruptly as his body convulsed. When the shadow withdrew, Mark collapsed into his seat, his eyes wide and vacant. "Mark!" Karen shouted, rushing forward, but I grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "Don't!" I hissed, my heart pounding. The shadow didn't linger. It moved to the next passenger, then the next, pausing briefly before each one as if it were searching for something, or someone. I could feel Karen trembling beside me. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. "How?" I asked, glancing toward the door behind us. The idea of moving closer to the shadow-filled void outside the train was almost as terrifying as staying where we were. Another scream erupted, this time from the back of the carriage. A woman had collapsed, her face pale as death, her body as limp as a rag doll. "They're taking them," Karen murmured, her voice barely audible. The shadows weren't killing. They were collecting. Panic erupted like a wildfire. Passengers scrambled from their seats, pushing and shoving in a desperate attempt to flee. Some tried the rear door, but when they slid it open, a wall of swirling mist greeted them, impenetrable and cold as death itself. "We're trapped," someone shouted. Karen gripped my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. We need to move. We can't just sit here. The shadow continued its slow procession down the aisle, deliberate and unhurried, as if it knew time was on its side. Each step seemed to drain the warmth from the air, and the lanterns above flickered more erratically with every passing moment. "Back car," I said, my voice shaking. "Maybe we can get to another carriage." Karen nodded, and we joined a small group hurrying toward the rear of the train. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the shadow pause again, its formless head tilting slightly as though watching us. My stomach churned with dread. When we reached the door to the next car, Mark's son, a wiry teenager named Caleb, wrestled with the latch. "It's jammed," he yelled, slamming his shoulder into the door in frustration. "Let me try," I said, stepping forward. The metal handle was cold, almost painfully so, but with a hard pull and a loud screech, the door gave way. The group piled into the next carriage, and I slid the door shut behind us. For a brief moment, there was relief. This car looked similar to the last: velvet seats, brass fixtures, and flickering lanterns. But it was empty, eerily so, and the oppressive silence returned. "Where is everyone?" Karen asked, her voice echoing slightly in the emptiness. "They must have all been in the first car," Caleb said. He didn't sound convinced, though. I noticed something strange about this carriage. The shadows were here too, but they weren't moving. They clung to the corners and the ceiling, unmoving, as if they were lying in wait. "Don't touch them," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Touch them?" Caleb snorted, trying to mask his fear with bravado. "Are you kidding? I'm not getting near those things." Karen's gaze was fixed on the windows. "Look." The mist outside had changed. Instead of swirling gray, there were shapes within it, vague, distorted figures that pressed against the glass, their hands and faces melting into the fog like wax dripping down a candle. One of them knocked. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a hollow tap-tap-tap that sent a shiver through the group. "They're trying to get in," Karen whispered. "No," I said, my voice cracking. "They're already in." At that moment, the lights flickered once more and went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The darkness was absolute, so thick it felt as though it pressed against my skin. My breaths quickened, and I could hear the others doing the same, short, shallow gasps echoing through the silence. "Where's the lantern light?" Karen whispered, her voice trembling. "Why isn't it coming back on?" I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I tried to activate the flashlight. The beam sputtered weakly, illuminating only the small space around me. I pointed it toward the group. Karen's face was pale, her eyes wide. Caleb stood next to her, clutching the back of a seat, his knuckles white. The others were huddled near the far wall, their faces shrouded in shadows. But it wasn't just the passengers in the light. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Behind the group, in the periphery of the flashlight's glow, I saw movement, a ripple in the darkness, like a shadow breaking free from the wall. "Everyone, stay together," I said, my voice hoarse. "What is it?" Caleb asked, his voice cracking. "Just, don't move," I replied. The ripple grew, taking form. A head, shoulders, arms, they emerged one by one, like a figure stepping through a veil. Its faceless void turned toward us, and the room seemed to grow colder with its gaze. Karen grabbed my arm. "What do we do? We can't just sit here and wait for it to take us." She was right. If we stayed, we'd be trapped like sitting ducks. "The next car," I said, nodding toward the rear door. "We have to keep moving." The others hesitated, their fear rooting them in place, but another figure began to form, this time closer to the middle of the room. That was enough to spur them into action. "Go!" I shouted. We bolted for the door, Caleb leading the charge. I kept my flashlight aimed ahead, but I could feel the shadows shifting behind us, their movements quicker now, more deliberate. Caleb yanked the rear door open, and we spilled into the next carriage. It was darker than the last, with no lanterns lit and no sign of life. "What now?" Caleb asked, his voice high with panic. I didn't have an answer. The mist outside the windows pressed harder against the glass, distorting the view and swallowing any light. As we gathered near the center of the carriage, I noticed something on the floor, deep gouges running along the wood, as if something with claws had been dragged through here. Karen saw them too. "This isn't right. This whole thing, it's like," she trailed off, her eyes darting to the corners of the room. The shadows here weren't moving, but they felt heavier, more oppressive, as if they were waiting for us to slip. "We have to keep going," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the train. It wasn't human. The growl reverberated through the carriage, low and primal, like a warning from something that didn't belong in this world. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding us in the suffocating darkness. "What was that?" Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. "Something we don't want to meet," I replied, gripping my flashlight tighter. The others began to edge toward the rear door, moving as quietly as possible. Caleb was the first to reach it, but when he tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he hissed, rattling it in frustration. "Try harder," someone behind him urged, their voice trembling. But before Caleb could make another attempt, the growl came again, this time louder, closer. The shadows along the walls seemed to ripple in response, as if they were alive. "We're not alone," Karen said, backing away from the center of the carriage. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, sweeping it across the room. For a moment, the beam caught something, eyes, glowing faintly with an unnatural yellow light. They were low to the ground, moving steadily toward us. "Run!" I shouted. Panic broke the fragile silence as we bolted toward the far end of the car. The creature stepped into the beam of my flashlight, and I caught a glimpse of it, a hunched figure with elongated limbs and claws that scraped against the wooden floor. Its skin was mottled and gray, and its face was a grotesque amalgamation of features, like a nightmare stitched together from half-remembered horrors. It lunged, its claws swiping at Caleb, who barely managed to dodge. The group scattered, tripping over seats and each other in their desperation to escape. "Over here!" I shouted, motioning for Karen and the others to follow me. We ducked between rows of seats, using them as a barrier between us and the creature. It let out a guttural snarl, its movements unnervingly fast and fluid as it pursued us. Caleb was still struggling with the door, his fingers fumbling with the latch. Come on," he muttered under his breath. The creature closed the distance, its claws raking across a seat and tearing through the fabric like paper. Karen grabbed a brass lantern from the wall and hurled it at the beast. The glass shattered on impact, releasing a burst of light that seemed to momentarily disorient it. "Now, Caleb!" I shouted. With a final shove, the door creaked open, and we spilled into the next carriage. Caleb slammed the door shut behind us, locking it just as the creature's claws raked against the glass. We backed away, watching as it pressed its grotesque face against the window, its yellow eyes glaring at us with an almost human hatred. "What is that thing?" Karen asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my chest heaving. "But it's not going to stop." The creature let out a furious roar and began clawing at the door, the glass cracking under the strain. "We can't stay here," Caleb said. "We have to keep moving." He was right. The train seemed to stretch endlessly, but staying in one place wasn't an option. We turned and ran deeper into the unknown, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass chasing us into the next carriage. The next carriage was unlike the ones we had passed through before. The polished wood and brass fixtures were gone, replaced by something far older and more decayed. The walls were warped, the seats torn and rotting. Cobwebs hung in thick strands from the ceiling, and the air reeked of mildew and decay. "What is this place?" Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, shining my flashlight around. The beam barely penetrated the oppressive darkness, but what it revealed made my stomach twist. There were faded signs of life here, abandoned luggage, crumpled tickets, and hats and scarves left as though their owners had simply vanished. "Do you hear that?" Caleb asked, stopping abruptly. We all froze, straining to listen. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. But then it grew louder, a rhythmic tapping, like the deliberate steps of someone walking with a cane. "Someone's coming," Karen said, her grip tightening on my arm. "Or something," Caleb muttered. The sound drew closer, echoing through the decrepit carriage. My flashlight caught a glint of metal ahead, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He wore a tattered conductor's uniform, the once pristine fabric now frayed and covered in stains. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were sunken hollows that glowed faintly in the dim light. In one hand, he held a rusted lantern, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows across his gaunt features. "Tickets, please," the conductor said, his voice a raspy whisper that sent chills down my spine. None of us moved. "Tickets," he repeated, louder this time, his tone carrying an edge of menace. "We don't have any," Caleb said, his voice shaking. The conductor tilted his head, his hollow eyes narrowing. "No tickets?" He stepped closer, the tapping of his cane growing louder. "Then you don't belong here." Karen took a step back, pulling me with her. "We're just trying to get off this train," she said. "Can you help us?" The conductor let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Off this train?" He gestured around him with his lantern. "There is no getting off. Not for you. Not for anyone." The tapping of his cane ceased as he stopped directly in front of us. For a moment, we stood frozen, staring into the void of his eyes. Then, without warning, he raised his cane and brought it down with a deafening crack, splitting the floorboards beneath our feet. The train jolted violently, throwing us to the ground. The conductor loomed over us, his expression twisted into a grotesque grin. "You're already where you're meant to be," he said. "Run!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. We darted past the conductor, his laughter echoing behind us as we stumbled through the carriage. The next door was rusted and warped, but with a combined effort, we managed to force it open. As we stepped into the next car, the train lurched again, and I glanced back. The conductor stood in the doorway, watching us with that eerie grin. "There's no escape," he called after us. "This train only goes one way." The door slammed shut behind him, and the sound of his cane tapping faded into the distance. The next carriage was in worse shape than the last. The seats were mostly gone, replaced by rusted metal frames and broken windows. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under our feet like it might collapse at any moment. "We can't keep going like this," Karen said, her voice strained. "How many cars have we passed through? How far is this thing going?" I didn't have an answer. The train seemed endless, stretching into infinity. Each carriage was different, yet all equally decayed, and each one seemed to grow darker and more oppressive. The flickering light from my flashlight barely illuminated anything beyond the immediate area, and the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides made it feel like we were being swallowed whole. Caleb's breathing was shallow, rapid, as if the air itself was becoming harder to breathe. "What was that thing?" the conductor. Is he a ghost?" "I don't know," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But it doesn't matter. We can't stop. We need to keep moving. Karen nodded, though I could tell from the look on her face that she wasn't convinced. We're stuck on this train. There's no getting off. She was interrupted by a sharp noise from the front of the car. A screeching sound, like nails on a chalkboard, echoed down the hallway. Everyone went silent, listening. There was something out there. Something worse than the shadows. Something worse than the creatures that had been chasing us. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but I couldn't see anything beyond the narrow beam of light. The air seemed to tremble with tension, and I felt a weight settling in my chest. Then the sound came again. This time, it was closer. The noise wasn't just one thing, it was many things. Like the scratching of dozens of claws, tapping against metal, dragging along the train's walls. It was the kind of noise you hear when something is trapped, desperate to escape. What is that? Caleb gasped, backing toward the rear of the car. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to face whatever it was. But we had no choice. The sound grew louder, the scraping and dragging becoming more frantic, until it felt like the walls of the train were closing in on us. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. That's worse, Karen muttered. Where did it go? Caleb asked, his voice panicked. I don't care, I said, grabbing his arm. We need to get off this train, now. We ran toward the next door, my flashlight flickering wildly as we went. But as I reached for the handle, something heavy slammed into the door from the other side. I yanked my hand back as the door rattled in its frame. What the hell was that? Caleb whispered, his eyes wide with fear. We stepped back, watching the door warily, but there was no sound of movement from the other side. I took a deep breath. We're not going to find any answers standing here. Let's go. With a single, desperate motion, I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. The next car was completely different. The walls weren't decayed, and the seats weren't broken. In fact, this car looked almost pristine, too pristine. The wooden paneling gleamed, and the carpet was spotless. But there was something off about it. The lights were too bright. The air was too still. And the passengers. The passengers were sitting perfectly still in their seats. Their heads were turned toward us, but their eyes were hollow, lifeless. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just watched us. Not again, Karen whispered, her voice breaking. I had no words. The train had been strange from the start, but this was something else entirely. They're not real, I said, more to myself than anyone else. They're not real. They can't be. But as I spoke, one of the passengers slowly raised their hand. It wasn't a wave. It was a beckoning motion. Get out of here, I said, grabbing Karen's arm and pulling her back. Now. We slammed the door shut and backed away as fast as we could, the feeling of hundreds of cold eyes following our every move. And somewhere deep in the train, something stirred. The carriage was suffocating, each breath more labored than the last as we pressed on. My flashlight was beginning to fade, its light flickering weakly with each passing second, mirroring the uncertainty growing in my chest. The walls seemed to close in with every step, like the train itself was tightening around us, inching closer to some unknown, inevitable end. Do you hear that? Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. I strained to listen, but it was hard to hear anything over the pounding of my own heartbeat. At first, I thought it was just the distant hum of the train, the sound of metal against metal, the faint creak of the wheels rolling along the tracks. But then, I heard it too, a faint whisper, as though someone was calling to us from far ahead. I nodded toward the front of the train. I hear it. Karen gripped my arm. What if it's another one of those things? Or, her words trailed off, and I knew she was thinking of the motionless passengers, their eyes locked onto us as if they were waiting for us to make the wrong move. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, even when there was no one in sight. The weight of those hollow eyes, the way the air seemed to hold its breath, made the entire situation feel like a fever dream. There was no exit, no safety, just an endless journey through the train. "There's got to be something ahead," I muttered, forcing my legs to move, even though every step felt like it was dragging me further into something I couldn't escape. "We just need to keep moving." As we made our way forward, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't in any language I recognized, just a series of syllables, like a chant or a prayer. It echoed from the walls, the floors, the very metal that surrounded us. Then, as we passed into the next car, the train seemed to shift beneath our feet. The lights flickered once more, and for a moment, the train swayed as if it had derailed, throwing us off balance. We all stumbled, but the motion wasn't enough to throw us completely. However, the sudden jolt brought something else with it, a new sound. The growl. It was closer than it had ever been, resonating from somewhere near the front of the train. It was a deep, guttural sound, full of menace. Something that should not be alive, something that should not be here. "What is that?" Karen gasped, backing toward me. "Move!" I shouted, pushing her toward the rear. I could hear the beast now, feel it getting closer. It wasn't just one creature anymore. It was a pack, a horde of them, moving quickly through the darkness, their claws scraping against the metal. We were out of time. But there was no way out. I turned to Caleb, whose face was a mixture of disbelief and terror. "We're trapped, aren't we?" he whispered. I didn't have the heart to answer. I didn't need to. The truth was clear in the terror reflected in his eyes. There was no escape from this train, no getting off. The wheels of fate had begun to turn, and we were nothing more than passengers on a one-way ride. The doors slammed shut behind us, locking us in once again. There was no choice but to keep moving, even though I could feel the heavy presence of the creatures, their shadows creeping through the cracks in the walls. The train roared forward, its speed picking up as if it were alive, as if it were hungry. And as it sped faster, the whispering reached a crescendo, a cacophony of voices, too many to count, too many to ignore. "Hold on," I said, my voice shaking with the fear that had taken root in my chest. But I knew it was futile. We weren't holding on to anything anymore. We were just passengers on a train that would never stop. Time had become a blur. I couldn't tell how long we had been running through the train, or how many carriages we had passed. The walls were all starting to look the same, dark, decaying, and full of shadows. The eerie whispering continued, louder now, filling the train like a storm of voices that never stopped. Each step felt like it was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't escape. "We can't outrun them," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "We've been running for hours, maybe days, and they're still coming." I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. The creatures, whatever they were, had been following us through the train since we first encountered them. Their growls, snarls, and scratching sounds had never ceased. They were closing in, and we were no closer to an exit than we had been when we first boarded. Suddenly, there was a flash of light up ahead. A bright light that seemed impossibly bright, cutting through the thick darkness of the train. I stopped in my tracks, squinting as the light flickered and sputtered. Could it be a sign? A glowing sign above a door. It read, "Last stop." I didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. The train had a final stop. But if this was the end of the line, where were we supposed to go? What waited beyond that door? "Is it a trap?" Karen asked, her voice trembling. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else, something like hope, hidden beneath the surface. "We can't go on like this." I didn't have an answer. But in that moment, it felt like we had no choice. We couldn't keep running forever. So, with a glance exchanged between us, we made our way toward the door. The air seemed to grow colder as we approached the exit. The growls of the creatures had stopped, but the eerie silence that followed felt worse. We reached the door, and with a trembling hand, I grabbed the handle. It was cold to the touch, as though the metal had been frozen by something far worse than the cold itself. I pushed the door open. The blinding light from the other side rushed in, almost blinding in its intensity. I shielded my eyes, trying to adjust, but it was like nothing I had ever seen before. The light didn't seem natural, and neither did the space beyond it. We stepped into what could only be described as a void. It wasn't a station, or a platform, or anything that resembled a normal place. It was a space beyond all reason. The walls were a shifting mass of darkness and light, constantly swirling like a storm. The ground beneath our feet was hard and cracked, like an endless desert of stone. The train had followed us into this void. I could see it now, its massive form looming behind us, its body stretching into infinity. The train had become part of this strange world, the tracks now swirling into the distance as though they had no end. I turned around to face the others, but I was too late. The door had already closed behind us, sealing us into this impossible place. And there, in the distance, I could hear something else, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps that echoed through the void. Something was coming. It wasn't the creatures from the train. It wasn't the ghostly conductor. No, this was something worse. From the depths of the void, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, with eyes that burned like molten fire. The figure walked toward us with slow, calculated steps, its presence so overwhelming that I could barely breathe. The end of the line, the figure said in a voice that rumbled like thunder. "This is where you've always been heading. There's no escape." My heart sank as I realized the truth. This wasn't a train that went anywhere, it was a train that had been circling the same place, over and over again, for eternity. There was no getting off. There was no salvation. The train wasn't just a means of transportation, it was a trap. The footsteps grew louder, and the figure loomed closer, its eyes fixed on us. We had come to the last stop. But it was no destination. It was the place where time and space collapsed, where reality ceased to exist. And we were trapped, forever. The figure stood before us, its presence suffocating, its gaze burning into my very soul. The molten eyes seemed to pierce through the veil of reality itself, and for a moment, I wondered if I had been staring at them for too long. Was it drawing me in? Was it controlling my thoughts, my actions? "Where are we?" Caleb's voice trembled, breaking the silence that had fallen over us. "What do you want from us?" The figure didn't respond at first. It just stood there, towering above us, its dark form seemingly composed of shadows and fire. Its features were constantly shifting, like it wasn't entirely real. It was as though we were looking at a reflection, a distorted, nightmarish mirror of something far worse. "You've already answered the question," the figure said, its voice like a low growl, vibrating through my bones. "This place, this train, it's where you belong now. Where you've always belonged. You're not just passengers. You're prisoners." "What are you?" Karen whispered, her voice hoarse, her eyes wide with terror. "Why are we here?" "You are part of the journey," the figure replied, its voice dripping with contempt. "The train never ends. It never stops. It moves in circles, in endless loops. Those who board are never allowed to leave. Not until they accept it." "Accept what?" I asked, my voice a hoarse whisper. My mind was reeling, but I forced myself to stay focused. The figure, the train, the shadows, it all felt like a nightmare. But the cold reality of it was overwhelming. The figure's form shimmered for a moment, like the air was distorting around it. The light shifted, casting long, crooked shadows across the cracked stone ground beneath us. Your destination, it said, was always here. The train was the means. The journey was never for you to understand, it was for you to become part of it. The endless train, the passengers, the whispers, they are all part of this cycle. Your minds will break. And you will join them. A horrible thought bloomed in my mind. The passengers. The dead ones. The ones whose eyes were empty and who had never moved. They were us. They had been here before. They had been passengers, too. And now they were nothing but reflections, trapped in this endless, horrifying loop. No. I said, shaking my head in denial. This isn't real. It can't be real. It's as real as the fear in your heart, the figure responded, its voice full of malice. The train is a prison. It holds all who board it in its grasp, and it feeds off their despair. It feeds off the hopelessness. You've been here before, just like everyone else. I turned away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My eyes landed on something in the distance, a mirror, hanging in the air like a shard of glass. It reflected the void around us, but it also reflected us. All of us. I stepped closer, drawn to it. The reflection was distorted, blurred at first, but as I leaned in, it became clearer. In the mirror, we were sitting in the train, the same train we had boarded, except this time, there were no escape routes. The reflection showed us in the same state as the dead passengers. Our eyes were hollow, our faces gaunt. We were gone. We had already joined them. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't looking at a mirror. I was looking at a future, a warning of what we were becoming. We've already lost, I whispered, my voice breaking. We're trapped. We've always been trapped. The figure's laughter echoed in the void, cold and cruel. You're not special. You're just one more group. One more set of souls to add to the collection. The train never stops. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, the train's ominous hum vibrating through the very air. The walls of the void cracked, splitting open like a fissure in the fabric of reality. And then, everything went dark. The sound of the train faded. The whispers stopped. The fire in the figure's eyes vanished. The last thing I saw before everything was swallowed by darkness was the reflection of our faces in the mirror, the faces of those who had been lost to the train. And in the silence, there was only the sound of the wheels of the train, slowly turning, over and over again.